The Boston Celtics are in sole possession of second place in the Eastern Conference. What's up, everyone, and welcome in to Your Celtics Source, episode 48, home of your 23-12 Boston Celtics. Coming off of a MVP performance from Jaylen Brown, a game against the Chicago Bulls on Monday night where it wasn't Jaylen Brown who went off, but instead the role players and Anfernee Simons and other guys. Over the last week, Jordan Walsh has been removed from the starting lineup and replaced with the original starter for the season in Sam Hauser. Not that Jordan Walsh has done anything wrong, but just a wild, occurrence of events over the last couple of games here from the Celtics and around the league. The Thunder have dropped 2 games in a row to some pretty inferior opponents in that as well. It's just been a wild week, and unfortunately, I haven't been able to react in live time to any of this as I've been traveling and haven't had the chance to sit down with reliable internet, to be honest, and record an episode. Which is why I want to take this episode to do a little bit of a quick instant reaction on the Chicago Bulls Celtics game from Monday night. Obviously, it's not going to be, instant by the time you're watching this. But we are going to spend the majority of the show talking about Jaylen Brown and the fact that I think he has a legitimate chance of a top 2, MVP status by the end of the season, right? With Nikola Jokic going down, there's only one MVP, and it's SGA, and he's going to win it pretty much no matter what. But with the way the Lakers are not playing well right now, and if the Celtics are in second place in the Eastern Conference, who's to say Jaylen Brown isn't a number 2 MVP right now? But that being said, let's start with a little bit of a reaction to the Chicago Bulls Celtics game on Monday night, where the Celtics win 115-101. And, it really wasn't a great game from the Celtics or the Bulls in really any facet of the game. First of all, this wasn't a game where Jaylen Brown went off for 30 points, 35 points like we're accustomed to seeing over the last month and a half right now. He has, by the way, 20 games this season with over 30 points. Just ridiculous. He would be, if the season ended today, he'd hold the record on the Celtics for most points per game average in a season. But that's for another day, or for another, later in the show. Right now, with this game, I think this is a game where Anfernee Simons shows you that, yes, maybe he's not the 30 points per night scorer on a bad team in Portland and plays no defense. He can be a legitimate weapon for you off the bench in a championship contending season, which this one, by the way, is, coming into tuition pretty quickly. Yeah, I know we came into the season saying this might not really a gap year, but this might be a year where they're not really contending for a championship. But second place in the Eastern Conference, who's to say this team can't make a run to the NBA Finals? But Anfernee Simons, Joe Mazzulla praised him after the game, saying that, it's not just the scoring that you need from him, right? Obviously, he comes into the season being the storyline around him being his just horrific defense. And we saw that to start the season. There were, moments throughout games where he would just be caught sort of watching a play and get backdoor cut, or he'd lose sight of the guy he's supposed to be guarding, right? I don't think the biggest problem with him was him getting, beaten one-on-one, right? He is a quicker guard. Yes, there's going to be players that can do that, but it's the bigger things of just, paying attention to your surroundings and guarding, multiple guys at once by your positioning, right? If you're, off a little bit and you can see, a guy in the corner, a guy at the top of the key, and be able to sort of sprint out to either of them to guard a shot. He had trouble doing that over his career in Portland. And over the last week, and really, last month or so, Simons has turned into, nobody's going to say he's a great defender. That's never going to happen he's 6 foot and just a naturally born bad defender. But we see this with Steph Curry over his career, right? You just have to be playable, right? You have the offensive talent. That's the hardest thing to get in the league, right? If you can score and you can create your own shot and you don't need to rely on someone else to pass you the ball to score the basket, that is a commodity that very few players have in this league that play the role that Simons is being asked to play in for this team, right? And that part he has down. You can get better at the defensive side of the ball just by effort, and Simons is realizing that this year is not a year about him counting stats. It's a year about him, playing on a winning team and contending for something bigger than just himself. Something that, it's hard to get when you play for a team like Portland, which, over the last, 10 plus years has been a lottery team for the most part. And Simons has figured out that I just have to come in, knock down a couple threes, which he already does anyway, and just make an impact on the defensive end. It doesn't have to be a steal each and every night. It could be as simple as just a defensive rebound, or, you force a turnover by just being in the right position and forcing a player to make a bad pass or pass it to your teammate. Stuff like that maybe doesn't show up in the box score, but impacts winning, consistently when you do stuff like that. And that's stuff that we haven't seen from Simons, and we're just now starting to see it. And I think that's the reason why Joe Mazzulla now has trust to leave him out there longer, and we're seeing his offensive potential now come back into a reality because he's getting enough reps out there because he's being allowed to stay out there. And that's the biggest thing I get out of this game because, there wasn't really much else in this game besides the fact that the Celtics won, the majority of this game just on hustle and effort, right? They didn't have a great shooting night. Obviously, I think late into the game, they did turn it around from three. They end up shooting 20 of 52, 38%. Right? That's still a lot of threes, 52 threes to only make 20 of them. It's not a great percentage. And I think this was a game where, you're playing a team that is perennially a 39-win team, always the 10th seed, 9th seed in the Eastern Conference. And I'm not saying they took it lightly or anything, but it was just a game they didn't have it going. And they realized that with the team that they're playing, the caliber of the team on the other end, they could just shoot their way out of it. One of the few times this season where, it's worked to just continue to chuck up threes. For the first half or so, they were well under, 38%, and they got it up to 38 by the end of the game, which is how this game sort of became a 10-point, 15-point win. Other than Simons going off in this game, you got a little bit of production from Payton Pritchard with 21 points. But other than that, it was a pretty well-rounded game. Jaylen Brown only scores 14 points, has 8 rebounds, 4 assists as well. I think Jaylen Brown sort of took the game off after his career moment on Saturday, which we're getting to. Okay, just you wait. We're going to get to Jaylen Brown. But that being said, this game was important, not because of how they won, but the other game going on that night in the Pistons-Knicks game where the Knicks lost, giving the Celtics the sole possession of second place. That's the bigger storyline from this game. There are players, we talk about this team and it being, the Jaylen Browns, the Derrick Whites, the Payton Pritchards, they carry this team. But right now, obviously, Jaylen Brown is doing stuff we've never seen before. But it's the role players that are, and it's a different role player each and every night, which is why I'm like, we can harp on Simon's performance in this game, but next game, it'll probably be another guy. It could be Jordan Walsh, Hugo Gonzalez, Luka Garza has played fantastic as of recently as well, on the offensive rebounds especially. Right? The Celtics don't have any trouble this season just throwing a guy in the mix, and it's seeming to fit perfectly. Something that I don't think anybody expected coming into this season. That the Celtics could just if Joe Mazzulla didn't like a way a guy's playing, you can just sub him out, bench him for, a couple minutes, put another guy in, and it might change an entire, game flow. I don't think anybody imagined that so many role players could impact winning for this team. Players that have played less than 2 minutes a game coming into this season. And that's just been the biggest storyline of this season. Overall, just how Joe Mazzulla has been able to just coach up this team, coach up the young players that have never really played before. Right? I think, the reason the Celtics are, playing so well right now, with Tatum's return still on the horizon, it's because Joe Mazzulla is the coach of the year, without a doubt. But getting to that point, right? I'm not surprised that Simon did this. I'm not surprised that anyone's doing this right now at this point in the season. We've seen it. Everybody's had their moment. I think we're waiting for a Shireman moment still. I think that's probably the one player we haven't seen much of as of recently. I'm not really sure what happened to Chris Boucher. He hasn't played a minute, not even a minute in the last, 2 months almost now. I don't know why, because I felt like coming into the season, he could be a great, sort of depth piece at, a center position with his height and give you a little bit of a bigger lineup without a actual center out there. And we haven't seen much of him, so I'm not sure what's going on. I think you could use him. But that being said, the Celtics are playing so well right now, you really don't want to change anything up. But that being said, I think we move on to what we really need to talk about. And it's Jaylen Brown. 50 points, ties his career high in Los Angeles with all sorts of celebrities in the arena. An arena that is made for Clippers fans with the way that Ballmer has sort of set up the wall and all the different, modern technologies, and it's a standing ovation from him. And I think we take a step back and we look at how he got to that. And he gets to it, first of all, he comes into the game with the motivation, the chip on his shoulder, which Jaylen Brown always carries a chip on his shoulder, okay? It doesn't matter. He's always going to find something. And, he's been snubbed over his last, many years in Boston. You look at the Olympics and how he, didn't get onto the Olympic roster. You look at the Player of the Month and how he wasn't there and how, he's been treated in some places around Boston, stuff like that. And that he takes that and he brings it into the game and, he sort of proves his worth each and every night. And that's what makes him so special. And I know Joe Mazzulla appreciates it as well. He sort of likes that Jaylen Brown doesn't win these awards because it keeps him motivated, which the Celtics need a motivated Jaylen Brown to do anything this season, right? First and foremost, you can talk about how well Joe Mazzulla is coaching these role players and everyone else around him, but this team runs with Jaylen Brown, who has the second highest usage in the NBA, I believe, and one of the few players with that efficiency, or with that usage and still a high efficiency in carrying your team this well. He's the best mid-range shooter in the league this season. Maybe behind SGA, but a very close second. He's played with that edge this entire season. He asked Joe Mazzulla on the plane from Sacramento to Los Angeles to guard Kawhi Leonard, right? And he does that pretty much the entire game while having this game offensively, right? It's very rare, and the Celtics have two players like that, one in Jason Tatum, one in Jaylen Brown, who, spend that much effort on both ends of the floor, right? You look at the top offensive players in the league, Luka, SGA, SGA is not as bad as Luka for sure, but I think Jaylen Brown, and Jason Tatum to that extent are two of the best two-way players in the league in their ability to spend, entire, games, with full energy, full effort guarding another team's best player and then not be tired or have the stamina to go down and give you 50 on a night offensively, right? And I think there's two things with Jaylen Brown right now. One is the shot making, the other is the playmaking. And, I thought we were going to see teams double him, constantly, force it out of his hand, make him become a facilitator and a playmaker. And I thought the Celtics at least were going to struggle with that. There wouldn't be enough offensive players around him capable of knocking down shots consistently to hurt teams when they double Jaylen Brown. And I thought he was going to be blitzed from all over the place. And teams have done that, less than I thought. And partly the reason for that is his ability to find a open guy with a good shot, or with a, not necessarily a good shot, but with space to take a good shot, with space to make a play from there, and not into a rush shot, right? We've seen this in the past with Jaylen Brown, is he'd make a good pass, but it'd be a little too late or be into a contested area, and it'd get there, but then the shot wouldn't be a clean shot. It'd be rushed and, a little janky coming out of the hand. And his ability, the way he's playing right now, reading the defense and finding a pass, very similar to what Jokic does. Just finding that pass before the defense even realizes what has happened. But I think, the criticism, that's really what I want to talk about with him. We talked about the snub for Eastern Conference. His stats are, I think are better than Jalen Brunson's stats, especially in December. They're pretty similar, but, the Celtics have the better record. That should give him an edge. He's scoring more points per game. He's doing, more rebounds per game. I think Brunson leads in assists, but I think that's pretty much it. Other than that, JB leads. He's still overlooked in All-Star voting. I think by the end of the season, if he keeps this up, he'll be not only an All-Star starter. Obviously, he's going to be an All-Star starter despite the fans voting for him, but he's going to be first-team All-NBA. But I think, I know he calls it, a personal resume or a popularity contest for All-Star voting, and yeah, it is. 50% is fan vote, but I think he's going to get enough appreciation from players and coaches that it's all going to work out in the end for him. And I think, what was cool about that game against the Clippers? He's wearing his own shoes for the first time. I think, there's criticism around, the sort of outside business noise, right? His own shoe, there's some, controversy around it, and Nike and whatever, and the Olympics all tied together, and he's wearing his own shoe for the first time, and, despite all this noise, he's going out there, he's keeping it all to himself, or he's keeping it quiet, and he's just going about his business. I do want to move on to Jordan Walsh a little bit, and then I want to finish it up with some interesting storylines from around the NBA. But the last thing I do want to say about Jaylen Brown is that, there's going to come a couple games where he's going to need to take a rest. You can't be playing him, every single game for 35 points a night. And the Celtics are 2-0 without him. I think you need to pick and choose your moments when you want to rest him. And I know I think he's, less argumentative than Tatum is about resting, right? Tatum, almost refuses to rest. But that being said, I think if you're Jaylen Brown, you have to take that rest as a positive, as a sign of respect that, the Celtics need you so much right now that, the games that they're choosing to rest you on are, less formidable opponents, and they are, more likely to win, and that you gotta take that as a good sign that, the work that you've done right now doesn't go unnoticed. But moving on to Jordan Walsh, and then we'll wrap it up with some wild storylines from around the league. He gets moved out of the starting lineup, and I think a couple reasons for this. One is he's been sick over the last week or so, and he hasn't really played well. And Joe Mazzulla says it's not really about Jordan Walsh. It was more about Hauser playing well. But that being said, right, Walsh could easily be a player that sort of goes and pouts about it and sits at the end of the bench, and you don't see him again for a while. But Joe Mazzulla doesn't give up on him quite yet. He puts him in off the bench, and he just goes off. He just responds with one of the best games of his season. He takes that, chip. We talked about chips on the shoulder with Jaylen Brown. Jordan Walsh now has a chip on his shoulder after being benched, and he has just a career game. Rebounding, defense, hustle plays, guarding James Harden, Kawhi Leonard for the entire game, right? Jaylen Brown guarded Kawhi, so Jordan Walsh was on James Harden, right? One of the best scorers of all time. He wasn't pressing offensively either, right? Often you see guys when they get benched, they are, they feel the need to come in and just show that they still have it offensively, and they're chucking up threes and they're trying to force their way to the basket, and that often leads to a less desirable outcome because they lose the ball in turnovers, or they're not shooting well, they're stressed. And Jordan Walsh, he just plays within the flow of the offense. He doesn't force it. He just lets the game come to him. And he comes off the bench, and then he gets extended minutes into the game as the game goes on, right? Something that you don't see often with the bench players, right? Joe Mazzulla just keeps him in for an entire second quarter stretch just because of how well he was playing. Jordan Walsh, right? I think the Celtics have a lot of those players where we talked about that. Joe Mazzulla coaching up guys like Ugo, Walsh, Shireman, all to do just their role. And Jordan Walsh realizes that that's how he gets more minutes. He's not going to get more minutes by trying to become Jason Tatum and score the basketball. He's going to get minutes by, locking down a opposing offensive player, getting rebounds, and then capitalizing when your offensive moment comes, but not, letting the game come to you, not you trying to go out and get your numbers. But I'm going to wrap up this show with some of the wild things over the last a couple of games, or a couple of days around the NBA. First of all, the Celtics are, if I am mistaken, they are 3 games out from the Pistons. Obviously, we talked about this a little bit earlier with the Pistons win over the Knicks. Tatum could be back, within a month from now, to be honest. I don't think it's likely, but he could be. And, I don't think it's a bad bet to, put money on the Celtics winning the Eastern Conference. I'm not going to do it, but, I don't think that's a terrible bet. I wonder what the line is right now. But, the Thunder, they've lost games to the Phoenix Suns and the Charlotte Hornets of all teams. This team is not as good as we thought they were. It's almost impossible for them to break the record now. They might not even get to 70 wins. It's going to be hard to get to 70 wins, maybe even 68 wins. The Spurs definitely hold their number. The Wolves beat them. And now 2 teams in the Suns and the Hornets. The Suns, by the way, lost to them by almost 50, obviously without Devin Booker. But still, they lost to them by 50 in the NBA Cup quarterfinal. And it just feels like I can't pinpoint yet what their weakness is. But something's going on with the Thunder right now that we need to keep an eye on. Because I think everybody had them after the first month of the season as the team that was going to be basically unstoppable and have an easy path to the championship for a consecutive year. And I'm not so sure about that anymore. Denver obviously has had their number, or at least, made the series go longer than expected over the last couple of years in the playoffs. And obviously Jokic is out. But if you're the Thunder and you're the 1 seed and Denver, maybe they slip without Jokic in the next, month and a half, I don't think you want to find Denver in a first-round matchup coming out of a play-in game, which, is a likely scenario. That would be a rough first-round matchup for the Thunder, right? You're getting a team that is really a 2nd seed, and you're getting them as an 8th seed. We talked about the Thunder. I think, there are also some other games from tonight that we can talk about. I'm looking at them here. The Raptors win against the Hawks. Trae Young is looking for a trade, possibly. I think the Wizards were, a suggested option. And, unfortunately for him, we know the player he is. He's a great offensive talent. He doesn't play a lick of defense. The Hawks are, almost, 10 points better than without him on the court, something like that, maybe even more. And I think Trae Young, if he goes to the Wizards, it'll be a place where, he doesn't have to worry about winning. He can just put up his numbers. But unfortunately, I don't think you will be winning with Trae Young as your centerpiece. He's just really a worse version of Luka Doncic, and the Lakers are already having problems with Luka Doncic. The Nuggets do beat the Sixers tonight. The Warriors stay, just at 500 with the Clippers win tonight over them. But, other than that, I actually have a couple more stats that I forgot to mention that I do want to talk about with Jaylen Brown, and then we'll call it a night. But, obviously he's averaging 33.7 rebounds and 6 assists in the month of December, January. He's averaging 2 stocks a game, steals plus blocks, shooting 52% on field goals, 39% from 3. 78 from the line is not great, but that's around where his career averages, to be honest, and 61% true shooting. They're 7-1. The Celtics are in their last 8 games. They had the best offensive rating in the NBA over the last month with a 126 points per game, points per 100 possessions. They have a defensive rating of 113th, which is 7th in the NBA, which, to be honest, is not terrible. If you have the best offense and a 7th defense, that is definitely a playoff, caliber team. We talked about how they're just half a game back, or they're half a game ahead of the Knicks, and they're actually just half a game back now with the 4th seed in the entire NBA, which is just a wild stat to imagine. But I'm gonna wrap it up here. Thank you guys so much for watching. Follow on social media, Instagram, TikTok. You can listen to this episode on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And we're going to get back to, now that I'm home, we're going to get back to our normal schedule with podcast episodes like this one coming out after every 3rd Celtics game. So I believe we play the Nuggets, then we play the Raptors, and we have Wemby and Luke Cornett return game on Saturday night, I believe. And so we'll have an episode coming out Sunday morning at some time. Maybe we'll do a little Patriots preview against the Chargers as well. But in the meantime, we are going to go live for an instant reaction after the Nuggets game. We are going to go live for both the Spurs and the Raptors game on Saturday and Friday night. Should have said it the other way. And for both those games as well, we're actually going to do a live stream for the entire game as well on YouTube. So make sure to check all that out. And until next time, go C's.